Okay, hello everyone. This is Colin Cox, and this is the Week 6 audio lecture for English 1010. Today we've started a new unit, so there's a couple of things that I want to do. I obviously want to talk about the Essay 3 assignment prompt, and I want to spend a bit of time just talking about what it means to do the work of comparing and contrasting. And in the second half of today's lecture, I want to say a little something about the essay that I asked you to read, because I think the layered essay is a fantastic example of how to deploy, at least primarily, a compare and contrast pattern or a compare and contrast strategy when developing a larger point or idea. But let's start with the prompt itself. And again, this is in the content tab. So go to the content tab, select the Essay 3 module, and it should be the first document or the first thing available to you. And I've provided some additional resources, which I won't talk about in too much detail, but one of the things you'll hear me talk about today is how you can, at least from a formal perspective, adopt, broadly speaking, one of two strategies for a compare and contrast essay, and a lot of those additional documents explain and explore those two strategies in more detail. But yeah, let's start with the prompt itself. So here we go. For this essay, you will compare and contrast two subjects within a broad topic. For example, consider this topic. Which running shoe brand is best, Nike or Puma? As you can see, this question implies that one of these two running shoe brands may, for example, increase one's ability to run faster, more efficiently, etc. Having such an implication is one of the requirements for this assignment, so be sensitive to that. When searching for your essay's implication or implications, be specific. Notice I do not simply ask which shoe is best, I ask which running shoe is best. I think even modifying it is important because that both creates opportunities, but it naturally excludes other possibilities or opportunities, which is important because if your topic is too broad, it will be just unwielding. And I think, again, specificity matters here. I also narrow my focus by comparing and contrasting two brands instead of 4 or 5. And I'll pause here and say something. I think this is also important. Obviously, depending on, let us say, the size of your essay, your compare and contrast, or what you decide to compare and contrast, the different subjects you select, it might vary. But as you'll see when I talk about the minimum word count, I'm asking you to write, at least at minimum, a modest-sized compare and contrast essay. So please keep that in mind. If you select more than, let us say, 2 subjects, I think it will just get a little too big. But I've created some other questions you may want to consider when thinking about your topic. And these are not questions that you need to actively integrate into your essay. I would say instead these are questions best asked during the brainstorming early rough draft stages. What will my reader learn after reading this essay? How can a reader apply this information to enrich their lives? Why does this matter? And please don't read that in a dismissive way. I think that's a question that all of us should ask anytime we think about writing anything. Why does this matter? And finally, am I generalizing, which is to say, am I writing in terms that are too broad and too general? And if so, how can I fix or remedy this problem? For this essay, and I cannot emphasize this enough, do not do any outside research. Instead, I want you to use personal experience as a means of making an analytical argument that is persuasive and well crafted. As always, even though personal experience has certain limitations, your personal experiences make you an authority, so use the resources of personal experience to inform, influence, and guide your essay. And I wanted to pause and just say something here about research. Again, you will write a research essay for me, so please don't think you need to do any outside research for this assignment. Now, I want to be clear. I would say if you need to do a bit of Googling just to clarify maybe terms, let us say, for example, you wanted to write an essay about the Puma Nike running shoe topic, and you wanted to clarify the exact cost of a pair of Nike tennis shoes, that's not, I don't count and consider that research. I would say that's just you collecting necessary information to be as precise as possible, and I don't think that's something you need to cite. So again, the kind of research that I want to do that I would argue constitutes research, we will certainly have an opportunity to speak about that once we arrive at the research essay. But for now, just rely on the resources of personal observation and experience. So something else that I will talk about, your essay needs to address a potential counter argument, and I'll talk about why that's a useful strategy and how you can use the counter argument as a way of developing your larger point. Like the previous two essays, the minimum word count is 800 words, and please adhere to MLA documentation presentation standards. And like the previous two essays, you will submit your final draft through D2L. So, okay, I wanted to pause for a moment and talk about what it means to compare and contrast. And again, please email me if you have questions. But the idea of the compare and contrast model is to arrive at, let us say, a particular conclusion, or to develop an argument by taking two subjects, and that's the language that I am using, and trying to understand the benefits and limitations of both, which is to say to compare and contrast both. But again, I think what's incredibly necessary about any compare and contrast essay is specificity with terms, right? So again, thinking about, and the language that I use here is implications, right? So another example, something else to think about is, let us say you want to compare and contrast options for lunch at McDonald's, right? So obviously, since you're thinking about lunch, you perhaps want to think about something that is that will provide enough food to satiate your hunger. I think that's an obvious implication. Now, some less obvious implications might be cost, for example. Maybe that's something that you, if you wrote that hypothetical essay, maybe that's something you would consider that you think would be important when thinking about either the benefits or limitations of a particular option for lunch at a particular restaurant. Something else that I say to my students as well is be fair with the subjects you choose. So if we wanted to follow this food example, I think one could argue that it is potentially unfair to say of the two subjects that I will write about, so again, this hypothetical essay where you are selecting lunch options at McDonald's, I think someone could reasonably say that if you select a cheeseburger and a side of French fries and a bottle of water as one subject, but your other subject is a cookie, that there's something unfair about that compare and contrast. Not that cookies are bad options for lunch. They sound like spectacular options, but I think you could understand how, especially if the goal is to satiate hunger, well, a single cookie probably wouldn't do it. Again, I think you could imagine a scenario where someone would argue a single cookie just isn't lunch, right? And so be as fair as possible when thinking about your subjects. Again, if we wanted to return even to this question of what would be the best running shoe, I think choosing a pair of Nike tennis shoes versus a pair of hiking boots, I think that would be unfair, right? That's a fundamentally unfair comparison because hiking boots, just by their very nature, they were not designed for running. They have a different purpose in mind. So when selecting both your topic, but maybe more importantly, your subjects within each topic, be as careful as possible, be as deliberate as possible, because you want your compare and contrast to be as fair as possible. So for the next couple of minutes, and again, I mentioned this earlier, I've provided these additional resources on D2L in the content tab in the Essay 3 module. The compare and contrast essay can be a little tricky for some students just because you are potentially grappling with a lot of different ideas and notions. The compare and contrast essay, just by comparison, for example, to the definition essay, requires potentially a little more planning and a little more thought regarding organization. And broadly speaking, there are two ways to organize a compare and contrast essay. You can organize your essay by the subjects, which is to say the subject by subject model, or you could organize your essay by points, which is to say using the point by point model. And again, I've provided examples of what this can look like. And what you'll notice from the reading that I asked you to do is both of the reading assignments, both of the authors, they basically hew to one of these two models. And it appears from my perspective that both authors hew a lot closer to the point by point model, which is to say they address particular points and then within those points grapple with each subject. But I want to allow you to have the freedom to select whichever organizational strategy you want. So review those different models, and if you have any questions about them, if you need any clarity about what it means to use, for example, primarily a point-by-point model or primarily a subject-by-subject model, please do not hesitate to contact me. And the final thing that I want to talk about before I say a few things about the layered essay for today, the reading that I asked you to do, which is to say for this week, is I want to address this language on the prompt about counter arguments. And I'll start by just defining what I mean by this. So often when we think about supporting a point, which is to say supporting our thesis statement or our larger argumentative claim, we often think of it in positive terms, which is to say I will say positive things to support my claim, which is to say I'll provide evidence. You should accept this idea or this point because of these factors or this criteria, so on and so forth. But there's another strategy you could deploy, which is the counter-argument strategy or the counter-argumentative strategy. And what you do here is, and I think it's particularly useful with the compare and contrast essay. And let us take, for example, the example that I provide on the prompt between Nike and Puma tennis shoes, right? Let us imagine that one of the points you want to address and explore is cost. And let us imagine, for example, that your thesis statement argues, or your thesis statement says that Puma shoes are the best running shoe option, and you want to support that throughout the essay. However, you acknowledge that, well, Puma, and whether this is true or not is irrelevant, it's just an example. But let us imagine you acknowledge that, well, I've said or I've addressed a lot of positive points about Puma, but I acknowledge that Nike tennis shoes are actually more cost effective. Okay, that would seem to at least complicate and potentially negate your larger claim. And you might even imagine that acknowledging that would potentially complicate or challenge or negate your larger claim. However, I think addressing a potential weakness, which is the essence of what it means to deploy the counter-argumentative strategy, does not necessarily mean that your argument loses all of its validity, because I think you can, I think you can address and acknowledge a potential counterpoint, but you can then argue against it. So, for example, you could acknowledge that, sure, again, hypothetically within the confines of this essay, you could acknowledge that Puma tennis shoes are more expensive. But you could then explain why that shouldn't negate your larger claim, which is to say your thesis statement. So I think that's an important stage in the counter-argumentative strategy. You acknowledge a potential weakness, you acknowledge a potential counter-argument that someone could make, but you then explain why your reader, for example, should not allow that counter argument to negate your larger claim. And this is something that I quite simply want you to try with this essay. It is a requirement. Try to think through a potential limitation to your argument, because not only does this allow you to think in a more robust way about your topic, but the ability to address a counter argument and then complicate said counter argument, I would argue, shows the strength and the dexterity of your thesis itself, that you as a writer, you as a thinker, can think through potential counter arguments and then complicate them. So hopefully what I just said explains what it means to deploy a counter-argumentative strategy. But again, if and when you have questions, do not hesitate to contact me. So, okay, with all of that front loading finished, I want to say a few things about the Laird essay, which I asked you to read for this week. So Ellen Laird wrote this essay in 2003, and I must confess, prior to the pandemic, I had considered cutting this from my syllabus. This is an essay that I have taught a couple of times in 1010, and prior to the pandemic, I suspected that if students still feel, let us say, some of the problems that Laird addresses or explores in this essay, I bet they don't feel it as acutely as maybe they did in the past. And then the pandemic happened, and I think all of us were forced to evaluate and reevaluate what it means to receive an education primarily online. And so I found at least a kind of revitalizing or this essay, it's the pandemic, as counterintuitive as this sounds, has maybe rejuvenated the relevancy of this essay. And I would certainly ask, and I think all of you taking this as an online course, taking 1010 online, might have some unique and interesting perspectives on this essay. But one of the best places to start, and you might notice that I do this quite often, is with the introduction. How does Laird introduce us to this topic? What does she do? What does she say to bring us into this argumentative space? And she begins by deploying this extremely interesting metaphor, the metaphor of the honeymoon. And this is how she begins. The honeymoon is over. My romance with distance teaching is losing its spark. Gone are the days when I looked forward to each new online encounter with students, when preparing and posting a basic assignment was a thrilling adventure, when my colleagues and friends were well-wishers, cautiously hopeful about my new entanglement. What remains is this instructor alone, often in the dark of night, facing the reality of my online classes and struggling to make it work. So I think this notion of a romance is certainly an interesting way of articulating both her initial fascination or attraction to online education, but also how that initial attraction has waned in clear and acute ways. And I think what Laird ultimately wants us to do here at the beginning is to think about that feeling that I suspect all of us had at the beginning of, let us say, an impassioned romance, right? Typically, and I always enjoy interacting with students about this question, there's almost this bashfulness or embarrassment that we allow ourselves to not see potential problems or what could be potential problems at the beginning of certain relationships or romances, and they only start to become problems much later once that shine has disappeared. And what's interesting is, and I think Laird is quite good at articulating this, the problems were always there. We perhaps didn't see them or refused to see them because of the novelty. And I think, again, that's something Laird is quite good at exploring in this essay, how initially with online education, there was an obvious novelty to it, and that novelty obscured some of the clear problems that she now has and wants to articulate with online education. And that is, in many ways, the thrust of this essay, seeing what has always been a problem as a clear and acute problem. And something else that I would encourage you to think about is, well, are these still problems? And again, this is one of the reasons why I really like thinking about and talking about this essay, is because I wonder if we have sufficiently addressed and corrected what Laird articulates as clear problems in this essay. And it seems for Laird, if we just wanted to isolate and explore the big overarching problem, I think for her, it's what happens in an educational space that lacks or is void of any, let us say, face-to-face interactions. And we get a sense of this in the penultimate paragraph. And this is, I'm starting at about the middle of the paragraph, but this is what Laird says. The lack of a face to match with a rhetorical voice provides the illusion of anonymity and thus the potential for a no holes barred quality to every discussion thread. The usual restraint characterizing conversation among classroom acquaintances evaporates online within about 2 weeks. Private conversations fuse with academic discussion before an instructor can log in. And so what I'm hearing here, and this is perhaps a consistent problem that Laird develops throughout this essay, is how when we are online, and I think the word anonymity is so important, we lose something. Yes, we gain a lot. Maybe this is not necessarily something that Laird addresses, but I think it's something that we all acutely understand when we interact online. We have this ability to communicate with people in ways that we could never do before, and perhaps even the idea that we can communicate with certain people, maybe in different geographic spaces, in ways that perhaps because we, let us say, interact in distinct social circles from one day to the next, that might preclude us from interacting with people in other social circles. Yes, we have an opportunity to do that online in ways that we cannot in, let us say, if we wanted to be conversational about it, our mundane, tedious day-to-day lives, we have this opportunity to just interact with different sorts of people. But I think, again, back to Laird's point about anonymity, I think her larger point is there is a sense of decorum, if we wanted to use that word, that should dictate and determine human interaction. And that sense of decorum, as she says, quote, evaporates when online. And I think for Laird, it is those distinct or it is this way that those distinct online sensibilities find their way into the classroom. And so part of what I think Laird wants to do in this essay is think through the ways that certain distinct social spaces, when they become online or when those spaces blend into online spaces or when online spaces infiltrate those distinct non-online social interactive spaces, when that happens, the online sensibility or distinct online sensibilities has the effect of cannibalizing all of those other spaces, which is another way of saying when you take an educational environment that has distinct sensibilities and put it online, according to Laird, it then just becomes another online space. And again, I think this is a moment where we could think through the degree to which Laird is still right about this. Is this true or consistent with your own experiences? Is it true that for you, is it true that taking online classes just feels like yet another online space without any clear distinctions whatsoever? Or is Laird accurate, is Laird wrong that actually, no, we've gotten a lot better in the near 20 years since she wrote this essay. We've actually gotten a lot better at demarcating between different online spaces and everything isn't just this let us say homogeneous online experience. That no, there are clear distinctions. You can differentiate, for example, between being on Twitter, being on Facebook, and taking an online college course. I think that's maybe one of the ways that we can think through and potentially challenge Laird if you, for example, think that no, things are different now. But I think Laird's larger point in this essay is, well, everything, again, just becomes cannibalized by these online sensibilities, and what would otherwise be distinct social spaces with distinct social rules and expectations, all of that just evaporates, as she says. And I think for her, that is what is ultimately frustrating and regrettable about using online platforms for education. It's all of the interesting particularities of what it means, for example, to be in college. It's all lost because, again, everything online has, according to Laird, a particular set of expectations, or maybe you could argue a lack of expectations. I think one of the more interesting moments in this essay is when she writes about how the kinds of conversations that you would have with an instructor or an educator in a traditional non-online environment, you seem to be encouraged to breach those normative expectations online. And I think a lot of this, again, it's just the product of what it means to be online. I think she offers this interesting example from her own personal life where if she, for example, is just having a bad day, maybe she had a bad night's sleep before, and maybe you as a student, if you were taking one of her classes in a traditional college classroom, you would potentially make certain unconscious accommodations. That's not something that would necessarily happen in an online space. Even as I am talking to all of you now, I don't know. I have no way of reading on your faces or your bodies how you're feeling on this particular day. So those obvious and natural accommodations that I would make, I'm not making them right now. I'm just talking to you as if everything is fine, even if it is not. And again, I think for Laird, her point is that's part of, regrettably, what is lost online, that we're not actually interacting as people. In fact, I'm not even talking to anyone right now. I mean, sure, I'm talking to you, but there's a clear and obvious gap. And I think for Laird, that is a regrettable loss with online education, that there isn't the kind of immediacy that we have when we interact together in the same space at the same time. And it seems for Laird, what she's perhaps attempting to articulate here is a notion of what education should be. So I think here we are perhaps seeing Laird blending a compare and contrast pattern with a definition pattern, right? She's attempting to understand perhaps what education should be. And I think for Laird, there is this essential component that education best understood requires this kind of immediate interactivity. And I would love to know what all of you think, because of course you're not doing that by taking this course, at least online, that kind of interactivity that Laird perhaps values, and that kind of immediacy that Laird wants to perhaps champion and celebrate. That's something that, to some degree, online education does not provide, but it's also something that none of you, at least for this class, are experiencing. So I think this is, again, a moment where reading this in 2022, or whenever you are reading this essay, you are in an interesting position to potentially challenge and antagonize Laird's thesis. But I also think, and this is perhaps the final thing I will say, it's important to at least acknowledge that this is not an essay that's offering some categorical, let us say, challenge, or this categorical rejection of online education. If anything, it's an essay that wants to function or operate as a kind of cautionary tale. Look, for example, to the conclusion. Are there strategies to manage these and similar difficulties? Of course there are. Thus, I continue with online teaching and welcome both its challenges and its rewards. But educators considering online teaching need to know that instruction in person and online are day and night. They must brace themselves for a marriage of opposites and build large reserves of commitment, patience, and wherewithal if the relationship is to succeed. So again, she's returning in an interesting way to this symbol or this metaphor of online education as a kind of marriage, as she says, of opposites, or education both in person and online as a marriage of opposites. But I think, again, we get a sense of Laird trying to be as, let us say, pragmatic as possible about this. This is not, as I said a moment ago, some grand categorical rejection of online education. Instead, you have a sense that for Laird, she wants this essay to function as a kind of cautionary tale. But I think we also get an indication or a sense of who she envisions her audience to be. This is not, and you can see this in particular if you read to the end and you see where she published this essay. It's in this publication called, and now I think it is exclusively an online publication, the Chronicle of Higher Education, or perhaps it was always online, which is a bit ironic considering the content of this essay. But we have a sense that her audience, it's not students, but it's actually educators, which makes sense because, again, the Chronicle of Higher Education is for people who primarily, let us say, teach or administer in higher education institutions. But I do think it is interesting reading this as either a student or someone who is not an educator, because even though she writes this essay primarily with educators in mind, I think this is another example of how you can write to a particular audience, yet still have perhaps broad or at least a broader appeal to a broader audience. And I think one of the ways she does that is by perhaps engaging these questions about what it means to exist online, even though she blends that with a very narrow and particular focus on educational spaces and institutions online. I think for anyone who has questions, concerns, or is just interested about what it means to have an online existence, I think this is part of that larger conversation, or this is an essay that enters into that conversation with a particular focus, yet it's still relevant, as I said a moment ago, to anyone interested in thinking through what it means just to exist online or to be a person online, and what those larger questions, again, whether it's questions of decorum, questions of personhood, etc. I think this is an interesting and integral piece of that larger conversation. So, okay, with all of that said, I think this is, again, I try to keep these audio lectures to about 30 minutes. I think this is a good place for me to stop. So as always, if you have questions, please email me. You know how to do that. But for English 1010, this is Colin Cox. Have a lovely day, and I will talk to you soon.